Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Brandon. I'm back. Welcome back to Marotta Media. Like I always say, I apologize for my extended absence. I just haven't had a lot of time to make full YouTube reviews lately. But it's October, it's Halloween season, and I've been watching a lot of horror movies lately. And one of those horror movies that I watched in theaters a few weeks ago is one of the newest releases this year, and that was The Exorcist Believer. The Exorcist Believer is a direct sequel to the original Exorcist film from 1973. In this movie, we follow two young girls who disappear after school one day, but then when they return a few days later, their parents realize that they might be possessed by the devil. So I went into The Exorcist Believer with possibly the lowest expectations you could imagine. And the reason for that is this movie was written and directed by none other than David Gordon Green. And just in case you aren't familiar, David Gordon Green was one of the writers as well as the director of the most recent Halloween trilogy. And I have been very open on this channel about my dislike for that trilogy, especially the final movie Halloween Ends, which I reviewed I think a year ago today at the time of this recording. And at the time I watched that movie, I just absolutely despised it. I didn't like really anything about it. And the more I think about it, the more comfortable I am saying that Halloween Ends is truly one of the worst movies ever made. But at the time Halloween Ends came out, I knew that David Gordon Green was going to be making a sequel to the original Exorcist film. And I was not excited about it, because I thought if this man ruined Halloween like he did, what is he gonna do to The Exorcist? And my expectations being as low as they were absolutely correct, because The Exorcist Believer sucks. This movie is awful, it's one of the worst movies of the year, and David Gordon Green is once again showing that he has absolutely no prowess or any sort of vision for the horror genre. And just as a disclaimer, I'm going to be using the original Exorcist as a reference for a lot of the points I make about this movie because the story beats are very similar and it tries to do the same things that the original Exorcist did. One of the biggest issues that I have with The Exorcist Believer is that almost every single character is just a shallow husk of a person. These characters are so empty. We might find out a few things here and there about them, but for the most part, we know nothing about them. And the biggest culprit of just being an overall empty character is the main character of this movie, Victor Fielding, played by Leslie Odom Jr. Not only is this character just shallow and boring, but Odom's performance is just wooden. And I hate to say that because I like Leslie Odom Jr. I like him a lot. He was nominated for an Oscar just a few years ago, and he's Aaron Burr in Hamilton, and I love Hamilton. But in this movie, his performance just suffered. And I think the reason his performance suffers as bad as it does is because he was given such horrendous direction. He always has the same facial expression in any given situation, no matter if it's good or if it's bad. And this is so much more evident in the scene when he gets his daughter back after she was missing for a few days. Her behavior is obviously not the same, but he never really seems alarmed by this. He never shows any sort of genuine concern for his daughter's well-being in this time. Because as soon as she comes back, she starts doing all these very strange things. She's saying things that a child her age wouldn't normally say. Her mannerisms are different. She's randomly showing up in his bathroom after the lights turn off. And there's even a scene where he wakes up one morning and finds that she has just completely pissed the bed. But at no point does he ever feel like he's genuinely concerned about any of this. He just seems more weirded out than anything. And as I said, he just has the same blank facial expression through all of this. Like, this whole thing is nothing more than an inconvenience to him, rather than something that he should show genuine concern for. And this goes for the whole movie. He never feels like he's worried or really all that scared about any of this. And this is such a stark contrast to Ellen Burstyn's performance in the original Exorcist. Just in case you need a small recap, in the original Exorcist, a mom named Chris, played by Ellen Burstyn, finds that her daughter Reagan might be possessed by the devil. And Chris is a single parent, and when all of these paranormal things start happening in her house, you feel her pain. You feel the sense of hopelessness with her because she doesn't understand what's happening to her daughter. She's constantly wanting answers from people, but nobody has any answers, and that upsets her. And it's sold beautifully by Ellen Burstyn's performance. She was brilliant in the original Exorcist. Speaking of Ellen Burstyn, her character reappears in this movie, and let me tell you, it is one of the most pointless uses of nostalgia bait that I have ever seen. She is literally only there just for nostalgia or for fans of the original Exorcist to be like, hey, I remember her. But other than that, her presence in this movie is completely pointless because I don't understand what was expected of her. Because according to this movie, after the events of the original Exorcist, Chris wrote a book about the events from the original movie that took place during Reagan's exorcism. And the book was a smashing success, and her daughter didn't like all the attention they were getting, so she abandoned her. And Leslie Odom Jr. is told this book by his neighbor, who I will mention later on, and he starts reading it and finding all these YouTube clips of interviews of her talking about her daughter's exorcism, and he finds her somehow. I don't know how he figured out where she lived. And he basically says, my daughter is being possessed by something, and your daughter was possessed 50 years ago. Can you help me? Honestly, what the fuck did he expect her to do? She's just a woman. She's not a priest or anything. She's not a psychic. She's not a medium. What did he want her to do? She wasn't even in the room in the original movie for the exorcism itself, so I just don't get it, man. But as I said, this movie follows a lot of the same story beats as the original. But in this one, it feels like the events leading up to the ending don't really have any sort of build-up or time to be developed, because they're completely rushed. And one of the noticeable reasons for that is when they came to the conclusion that these girls were possessed by some sort of demon. Because in the original Exorcist, all options are exhausted before they come to the conclusion that Reagan is possessed. Because at first they think she's sick, so her mom takes her to the doctor, they examine her, they do tests on her, and the doctors say there's nothing wrong with her physically, she's perfectly healthy. But then they say maybe something is wrong with her mentally or psychologically, and they find that nothing is wrong with her there either. And when Ellen Burstyn feels so hopeless that there is no helping her daughter, the doctors say to her, this might be more than just the metaphysical world. This might be paranormal. And they even ask her, have you ever heard of an exorcism? Because that might need to be done here. But in this movie, as soon as the girls come back home, their parents notice that they're acting strange, and the parents of the other girl that goes missing, whose name I can't remember, just go, oh yeah, she's definitely possessed by something. But I guess they go to church, and that means that they automatically know when a possession is happening. I don't know. None of it really makes any sense. There's absolutely no build-up to anything. It's all so rushed. And I won't get into spoilers, but the ending of this movie is just so hilariously awful that my friend and I were laughing in parts of it. This part that I'm about to mention might be a little bit spoilery, so if you don't want anything spoiled for you in The Exorcist Believer, then skip to this next part of the video. So remember earlier when I mentioned Leslie Odom Jr.'s neighbor recommended Chris's book to him, and that's how he found her? Well, that neighbor is now a nurse or something, and she mentions earlier on in the movie that like 40 years ago she was training to become a nun, but she abandoned those responsibilities because she had sex with a man and then got pregnant, but then she eventually had an abortion. But when it's time to come to actually perform the exorcism itself, nobody in the Catholic Church wants to do anything because they're like, oh, this is super dangerous, you can't do this. So the priest who was originally going to do it backs out of it at the last second, and Leslie Odom Jr.'s neighbor is like, I can perform the exorcism. What the hell qualifies you to perform an exorcism on two young girls other than the fact that you were training to become a nun 40 fucking years ago? And I swear to you, dude, the ending of this movie is like the Avengers of religion, because they have all of these people gathered in this house from all these different backgrounds, and it's just ridiculous. And I will say that there is a character that just shows up randomly out of absolutely nowhere, and then that character dies, and it's the funniest goddamn thing ever. It really is a Marvel-esque sort of formula. A random character just pops up out of nowhere, and it makes absolutely no sense. And this last problem I have with the movie is very small because it only happened in a few parts, but I found it to be very noticeable, and that was the sound mixing. There were quite a few scenes where I noticed that I could not hear anything that the characters were saying in that scene. Specifically at the beginning, one of the girls that goes missing is talking to one of her classmates at school, and the two of them are whispering to each other. And I'm not kidding you, I could not make out any of the words that they were saying. They were speaking that quietly. There's also another scene where characters are just yelling over each other, and I couldn't understand what any of them were saying either. And there's another scene where it's raining outside and these people are talking to one another, but the rain is so loud I couldn't hear them. This movie is just bad from a filmmaking standpoint almost all around. The sound mixing is terrible, the direction is terrible, the acting is terrible, the script is an absolute joke, and they did Ellen Burstyn so dirty in this. Really, what they did to her character in this movie is one of the most disrespectful things that I've ever seen. I've heard a few people say this, and I absolutely agree. This movie was made by people who love The Exorcist, but they don't understand it. The original Exorcist is one of the most influential and iconic horror films ever made. There were people that were passing out in the theater when that movie was playing. People were throwing up, going into premature labor watching that movie. And by today's standards, it might not be as scary, but you need to take into account the time period that the movie was made in. It was made in the early 70s. But this Exorcist movie has nothing like that. This movie has absolutely nothing scary or frightening about it. The scariest thing about it is how terrible it is. I really want to know, what sort of incriminating photos does David Gordon Green have of these studio executives? Because he must have something in order to be still getting work in horror movies and just absolutely butchering them. I don't get it. I just don't understand it. He really needs to go back to comedies because he has no idea how to make a good horror movie. Absolutely no idea. But yeah, this movie is just terrible. I expected it to be, but honestly, I think it might even be worse than what I was expecting. Overall, I would give The Exorcist Believer a 2 out of 10. And apparently this is supposed to be the first sequel in a trilogy. So, can't wait to see how much worse these movies get as they go on. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching my review of The Exorcist Believer. If you guys saw this movie, let me know what you thought about it. Did you like it somehow, or did you hate it like me? If you guys like this review, be sure to hit that thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe. If you want to see my previous reviews, I will link those right over here. Other than that, I hope you all have a tremendous rest of your day. I will see you all next time.